smoke curls through a shattered doorway. A man kneels behind a crumbling stone wall, his hands slick with blood that isn't entirely his own. His fingers move fast, mechanical. Reload, aim, fire. Outside, the sound isn't just gunfire anymore. It's thousands of voices, 21 men, 10,000 attackers, and not one of them ran. This isn't a story about winning. There was no version of this day that ended in victory. This is a story about a choice, the kind men make in the last few minutes of their lives, when every option except one has already been taken away. By the end of this video, you'll understand why military academies around the world still teach this battle, and why choosing to die became one of the greatest victories in military history. You've probably heard of the Alamo. 200 men, an overwhelming Mexican force, a wall that couldn't hold. You've probably heard of Thermopylae. 300 Spartans, a mountain pass, a delay that saved Greece. Both are legends. Both get movies, museums, mythology. Now do the math on this one. 21 men. Not 200, not 300. 21. Against a force historians estimate at 10,000. That's not a battle. By any rational military logic, that's a massacre waiting to happen in minutes, not hours. And yet, when news of what happened at a tiny signal post called Saragarhi reached London, something unusual happened. The British Parliament, not known for celebrating the sacrifices of colonial soldiers, rose to its feet. A standing ovation in the House of Commons. For 21 men, most of its members had never met and would never have called equals. So the question worth sitting with isn't how they lost, it's why they stayed. Retreat was, at least in theory, still on the table. Surrender was on the table. Instead, 21 men chose neither, and in doing so, turned an obscure frontier outpost into one of the most studied last stands in military history. To understand that choice, we have to go back to a border most people have never heard of. In a year, most people have forgotten. 1897, the Northwest frontier, a jagged, sun-scorched seam of mountains stitching together British India and the tribal territories of Afghanistan. This wasn't a border in any modern sense. There were no checkpoints, no clean lines on a map that anyone on the ground respected. It was rock, ravine, and rifle, a place where the British Empire's authority existed only as far as its soldiers could physically hold ground. The British were here for a reason bigger than the frontier itself. This was the era of the Great Game, the decades-long shadow contest between the British and Russian empires for control of Central Asia. India was the crown jewel of the empire, and Afghanistan sat like a loaded door on its threshold. Whoever controlled the frontier passes controlled the gateway. So the British built forts, roads, and telegraph lines into terrain that barely tolerated a footpath, an act the local tribes viewed not as protection, but occupation. Among those tribes were the Orakzai and the Afghan clans of the Tira region, proud, heavily armed, and deeply resentful of a foreign army carving permanent positions into land they'd governed for generations. These weren't disorganized raiders. They were fighters with grievances, numbers, and a very real chance of pushing the British out. If they could strike the right target at the right moment, that target required communication to defend. And communication, in mountains like these, meant something almost absurdly simple: mirrors, sunlight, and a chain of forts built specifically to see each other from miles away. Picture 3 points on a ridge, none of them within shouting distance of each other, but all of them needing to talk. Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan were the real strongholds, garrisoned, fortified, built to withstand siege. Between them, on a narrow spur of rock, sat Saragarhi, not a fort in the traditional sense, but a signal post, a relay station. The technology connecting them was called the heliograph, a device using mirrors to bounce sunlight in coded flashes across impossible terrain, a kind of 19th century Morse code written in light instead of sound. Without Saragarhi standing between them, Lockhart and Gulistan were blind to each other. Neither fort could see the other directly. The hills got in the way. Saragarhi was the eye that let both forts function as one defensive system instead of two isolated pockets. Here's the detail that turns this from military trivia into tragedy. Saragarhi was never designed to be defended against a serious assault. It held a signal tower, a small blockhouse, and barely enough space for 24 men. It existed to relay messages, not to survive an army. Nobody who built it imagined it would ever need to hold against more than a handful of raiders, which is exactly why, on the morning of September 12, 1897, when 10,000 tribal warriors turned their attention toward that fragile little outpost instead of the fortified positions on either side of it, the 21 men stationed there were standing somewhere. History had never asked them to be a wall. They were about to become one anyway. Numbers make headlines. Names make history personal. And these men deserve names, not just a body count. In command was Havildar Ishar Singh, a non-commissioned officer of the 36th Sikh Regiment. Accounts describe him as a seasoned soldier, respected by the men under him, the kind of NCO whose authority came less from rank and more from earned trust. He wasn't a general making grand strategic decisions from a map table. He was a working soldier, about to make the most consequential decision of his life, from inside a stone room the size of a modern garage. Alongside him stood men like Naik Lal Singh, Sepoy Chanda Singh, Sepoy Sundar Singh, ordinary soldiers whose biographies mostly didn't survive, but whose final hours did, recorded almost in real time by one man we'll return to shortly. Signalman Gurmukh Singh, the soldier operating that heliograph. These men belonged to the 36th Sikh Regiment, a unit built on a code that went beyond military discipline. In Sikh tradition, there's a concept called seva, selfless service, duty performed without expectation of reward, and another, nirbhau, fearlessness, specifically the fearlessness that comes from accepting death as simply part of living with integrity. This wasn't abstract philosophy to these men. It was the operating system they'd been raised on, generations deep, long before they ever put on a British uniform. That context matters because in a few hours, every one of them would face a version of that code with no room left for theory. From the watchtower at Saragarhi, someone saw the hills change color first, a shifting, moving mass where there should have been still rock and scrub, then the dust, then, unmistakably, men. Thousands of them, descending from multiple directions at once, banners visible, rifles and blades catching the early light. Historical estimates place the attacking force at around 10,000 Orakzai and Afghan tribesmen, some armed with modern rifles looted or traded from various sources, others carrying traditional swords and jaziles. This was not a raiding party testing defenses. This was a coordinated force with a specific objective: eliminate the signal post, sever communication between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, and open a path to push the British off the ridge entirely. For the tribes, this was more than territorial defense. It was a chance to reverse months of frustration, to answer British expansion with a decisive strike where the frontier was thinnest, and Saragarhi, small and lightly garrisoned, looked exactly like that thin point. Inside the post, 21 men watched an army roughly 500 times their size arrange itself on the surrounding slopes. There was no confusion about what they were looking at. Someone moved to the signal tower. Mirror caught sunlight. A message began flashing toward Fort Lockhart. 3 words that would open the most quoted radio log in Indian military history. They are coming. The tribal force didn't ease into the attack. They surrounded the outpost almost immediately, cutting off any illusion of retreat before the first shot was even fired. 21 men, a handful of loopholes in a low stone wall, and a perimeter that could be crossed by an attacker in seconds once the volume of fire became overwhelming. Inside, signalman Gurmukh Singh became something unusual for this era of warfare. A live narrator. As bullets struck the walls around him, he kept working the heliograph, flashing updates to Fort Lockhart almost as events happened. Numbers of attackers, positions, casualties. It reads, even today, like the earliest known transcript of a battle reported in something close to real time. The first request went out early. Reinforcements, if any could be spared. The answer came back with brutal honesty. Fort Lockhart's commanding officer, Colonel Houghton, didn't have troops close enough or terrain safe enough to reach Saragarhi before it fell. Sending men would likely have meant losing them on open ground without changing the outcome. Help, quite simply, could not arrive in time. That left the 21 men with the only decision that mattered. Retreat across open, surrounded terrain was tactically close to suicide. But surrender was not off the table. Tribal leaders reportedly offered terms. Lay down weapons and live. They didn't take it. Every man chose to stay at his post and fight. The attackers, unable to break through by sheer weight of numbers alone, changed tactics. They set fire to the main gate, using the smoke and flame to force an opening while covering their advance with heavy rifle fire. Wood cracked and gave way. What had been a defended perimeter became, within minutes, a breach. Inside, the fight collapsed into something far more intimate than long-range exchange. Ammunition, never plentiful in a post this size, began running out man by man. When rifles emptied, soldiers fought with bayonets. When bayonets weren't enough, they fought with whatever was in reach. Accounts describe individual soldiers breaking from whatever cover remained to drag a fallen comrade's rifle back to a firing position, not for the weapon alone, but because leaving a man's body exposed to the enemy went against everything they'd been raised to honor. Every one of those movements, in open ground, under fire, was its own small, almost certainly fatal decision. And through all of it, the heliograph kept flashing. Gurmukh Singh, positioned at the signal tower, relayed the battle almost as an unbroken sentence. Names lost, positions overrun, the perimeter shrinking room by room. For the men listening at Fort Lockhart, it wasn't a battle report anymore. It was a countdown, delivered in light, of men they knew, dying one at a time, faster than anyone could do anything about it. By the time the breach could no longer be denied, Havildar Ishar Singh made the last command decision of his life. He ordered the wounded men still capable of movement to fall back toward the inner blockhouse, buying them, if nothing else, a few more minutes, while he stayed at the breach alone to hold the line. What followed wasn't the kind of combat that photographs well or fits cleanly into heroic language. It was close, brutal, and short. A single wounded soldier against a press of attackers pouring through a gap he refused to abandon. He held it long enough to matter, and then he didn't hold it anymore. Inside the tower, Gurmukh Singh was still transmitting. Later accounts state he requested permission to set down the heliograph and pick up a rifle instead, to die fighting rather than signaling. Whether that permission came in words or in silence, what's certain is his final message, sent as the enemy broke into the tower itself, a request denied any further reply because there was no one left to answer. Then the flashing stopped. At Fort Lockhart, soldiers stood at the heliograph station, watching for a signal that had been arriving every few minutes for hours. It didn't come. The mountain between them said nothing at all. From Fort Lockhart, they didn't need a message to understand what silence meant. Smoke was already rising from the direction of Saragarhi, thin, steady, unmistakable. There were no survivors among the defenders. 21 men, every single one, had died at their post. Estimates of tribal casualties in return vary widely across historical sources, ranging from roughly 180 to over 600. A staggering toll inflicted by a garrison that never had a chance of winning. But that was never really the point. 21 men had just delayed an army of thousands, long enough to save two forts, Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, warned and given precious extra hours by Saragarhi's stand, were able to reinforce their positions before the same tribal force turned toward them. Both forts held. The delay purchased at Saragarhi hadn't just been symbolic. It had directly changed the outcome of the wider campaign. When the full account reached London, pieced together largely from Gurmukh Singh's heliograph transcripts, it did something colonial dispatches rarely did. It moved Parliament. Members of the House of Commons rose in a standing ovation for 21 Indian soldiers most had never heard of a week earlier, an almost unprecedented gesture in an empire not known for equal recognition of the men who defended it. All 21 defenders were posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, at the time the highest gallantry honor available to Indian soldiers under British command, roughly equivalent in prestige to the Victoria Cross. Beyond the medals, something quieter shifted too. British military command, often dismissive of colonial regiments, began treating Sikh units with a different measure of respect, one earned not through negotiation, but through 21 men who simply refused to leave a doorway. More than a century later, Saragarhi Day is still observed every September 12th, commemorated by Sikh regiments across India, the UK, Canada, and beyond. Ceremonies held in memory of men whose names might otherwise have faded into a single, forgotten casualty report. Military academies, including institutions across NATO countries, still study this battle, not for tactics, since there was no tactical way to win, but as a case study in something harder to teach. What discipline and conviction look like when every rational calculation says to stop. They didn't stay because they thought they'd win. They stayed because leaving wasn't who they were. If stories like this, the ones history almost let slip through the cracks, are worth remembering, subscribe. There are more of them waiting.